Hello and welcome to the week 9 recording of information related to kind of fundamentals of networking. I want to give you a little bit of background today, kind of some analogies that will help those of you who maybe don't know a whole lot about networking to kind of understand some information and a little bit of background about it without getting super technical. So that's kind of the goal for today. We'll get a little more technical in the next couple of weeks, although this isn't a class that's going to make you a real techie, so I want to keep it informational without overloading you or overwhelming you with too much deep information. So I want to begin by kind of using a highway metaphor to help you understand how networks actually work. So if we think about freeways like the interstates as being the backbone of the network, those are major thoroughfares in which the traffic can flow at a really high speed most of the time, and the traffic itself knows where to go. Generally, obviously, cars don't drive themselves, but traffic on highways, cars on highways, or vehicles on highways, they know where they're going. They're trying to get to a destination. The objective is to get there quickly. So at a point at which the vehicle is close to the final destination, then the vehicle leaves the freeway and takes smaller streets to get to that last destination, and that's kind of how networks work as well. So when we think about freeways between cities, that's a wide area network or a WAN that connects smaller networks together. And then when we get to actual city streets, we're talking about local area networks or LANs, and there could be multiple local area networks within any city, but we can think of those as the surface streets. So the surface streets feed into kind of the larger, maybe the bigger streets, thoroughfares, and then we get to the interstates after that, and networks kind of work the same way. So the final destination of any network traffic is the workstation, just like the final destination for a vehicle would be a garage or a parking lot. So then if we take this highway metaphor and we apply it to the concept of bandwidth, if we go back to vehicles, what is known is that the efficiency of roads like interstates and other roads, even city streets, peaks when about 40% of the road surface is actually covered with vehicles at any given time. Once the rate is more than 40%, then traffic slows down and you don't get where you're going as quickly. And networks are the same way. If there's too much traffic on any given network, then it slows down the transmission speed. So when we talk about the concept of bandwidth, it's actually the amount of data that is able to flow through the transmission medium at any given time. So that's impacted by the actual capacity of whatever medium you're using to transmit the data. So that could be wiring, cables, it could be wireless, so you're using transmission via air, it could be microwave, it could be fiber optics, and there's different technologies that are available to transmit network data at this point. So the capacity of the medium along with the volume of traffic is going to impact the ability for the information you want to transmit to get from point A to point B efficiently. And that takes us to a discussion about speed in general. Okay, now on the diagram here I have basically a highway system. And when we talk about earlier networks, we use a protocol called local talk, which was information that could be transmitted at a rate of about 230 kilobits per second. And if that doesn't mean anything to you right now, that's okay. It was actually the network protocol that was available back when I was in graduate school, and networking was kind of in its infancy in schools. And just very, very slow. And at that point, people, if they were accessing networks from home, were doing it through a really, really slow modem. You can see in the diagram that this is basically a two-lane road compared to a wider road for Ethernet. So when we go from local talk, which we don't use at all anymore, but again, we're going to use that as our baseline. And then we look at standard Ethernet, which is a protocol that still is in place at this time. Ethernet gets transmitted or is able to transmit information at 10 megabits per second. So if we want to make a comparison, we know that 10 megabits is equivalent to 10,000 kilobits. And so when we look at the comparison between the speed of the two networks, Ethernet is about 43 times faster than the former local talk. So just the ability to transmit information quickly is greatly enhanced by the conversion to Ethernet. And if you think about the kind of information that we're trying to both up and download at this point, we need the higher transmission speeds. So if local talk is the two-lane road that we see here, and Ethernet is 43 times faster, then it would mean that we're going from a two-lane road to about an 86-lane road in going from local talk to Ethernet. So I'm trying to kind of give you these metaphors so that you can put everything in perspective. Now, not only do we have standard Ethernet, but we also have what's called fast Ethernet. And fast Ethernet has the capacity to run at speeds of 100 megabits per second. So if we're looking again at lanes, then that would be about 860 lanes compared to the 2 lanes that local talk was able to handle and the 86 lanes that regular Ethernet can handle. We also now have gigabit Ethernet, which can run up to 1,000 megabits per second. So we'd have 8,600 lanes. So if you just think about traffic and how much more information is able to be transmitted with the additional lanes, you can gain an understanding of how important it is to have sufficient bandwidth and speed to be able to have the capacity to move the information efficiently. So in terms of putting everything together, the bandwidth is affected by a lot of different things, including the actual cable or wire type that you have. Baseband is able to transmit a single data signal at one time, and that would be our regular standard Ethernet. Broadband is cable that can support multiple signals over the same line. So if you have DSL at home, for example, you are using a broadband signal. That means that the cable that transmits the information from your computer out into the internet, it's not just on a single cable that comes directly to you. It's actually a shared cable that your neighbors also access. So it's able to transmit multiple signals over the same line simultaneously. And when we talk about television, when you're looking at your the options available to you, there's hundreds of channels available to you, and you're able to access all of those channels with the click of a button. So that data is being transmitted over a channel, a broadband channel that allows multiple signals to be transmitted simultaneously. So without trying to get too technical on you, there are different categories of cable, and you'll hear them referred to as Cat 3, Cat 5, and so on. Category 1 cable is the type of cable that you would use for regular telephone transmission. So if you have a phone line coming into your house, the end of it looks kind of like this. So it's just a little skinny plastic thing at the end. It's a very thin wire. That's a category 1 wire. So the connector is called an RJ11. Probably all of you are familiar with that, at least to some degree. Then we have category 2, which is data that can go up to 4 megabits per second, and that was used with the old local talk networking protocol, so it's not really used anymore, and actually it used the same cable as we would use for the phone. Category 3 cable is the kind of cable that you're used to seeing for your networking at school, your regular Ethernet cables, so it's a little bit thicker. The connector is a little bit wider and a little sturdier than the one that you use for homes, so that's the one that you're probably most familiar with. And then we move to other categories of cable. Cat 5 is probably what most of you are familiar with at your school sites at this point. That's fast Ethernet, and the cable actually looks the same as the Cat 3 cable. There is a difference which I'll get to in just a bit. And then we have 5E, Cat 5E, which allows gigabit Ethernet transmission. And then we also have category 6 and 7 cable, which allows you to transfer information even more quickly, more efficiently. So another set of information that you might hear in addition to the Cat 3, Cat 5, is the specification for the type of cable. So you might have heard 10 base T, 10 base 5, and the type of cable, when you hear things like unshielded, twisted pair, the twisted pair is the wires inside the cable. So they're either twisted or they're not twisted, but the length of the category that you're choosing determines the maximum length of that cable in order for the data to actually be transmitted. If you try to use longer cable than that, then it just doesn't work in terms of transmitting the information. I'm going to kind of get to all of these in a little more detail in just a bit. Not a lot of detail, but you'll notice here that fiber optic can be transmitted up to 2,000 meters. So it has a much greater capacity than the unshielded twisted pair cable which we're used to using. So the coaxial cable, which we don't use very much anymore for regular networks because it only has a transmission rate of about 10 megabits per second, which by today's standards is not very fast. And this is a picture of coaxial cable. It's probably pretty familiar to you because most of you likely have coaxial cable coming out of your wall and going into a television box. So it's still used in homes a lot and in schools for television broadcasting and viewing. The nice thing about coaxial cable is that it offers protection from other things that could potentially interfere with signals, such as radio frequency waves and other electrical interference. But if any of you have plugged in coaxial cable, you'll know that it's really bulky. It's kind of hard to twist it very much. So that's a disadvantage of using it, and that's why schools and businesses that were doing networking didn't typically use coax cable to connect computers. So this is what our twisted pair cable looks like. So there's a plastic sheath around it, and then inside that plastic sheath there are 4 pairs of wires, and they're color-coded. Those of you that come to do the 1-hour networking session with me on November 15th, which is an option in terms of your technical field experience, we're actually going to do a little bit of work with twisted pair cables, so you'll get to see the inside and, like I said, do some things. So twisted pair cable is used for Ethernet, fast Ethernet, and gigabit Ethernet. So like I said, it's very, very common. The more twists there are within the wires, the higher transmission rating. Also, the more twists there are, the greater the cost of the cable. So there's sort of a proportional relationship between cost and transmission speed and number of twists. The problem with unshielded twisted pair cable, which is the UTP, is that it is very susceptible to interference from different things like radio waves, electrical things, fluorescent lighting. And so in school environments, especially older schools that were trying to update to newer technology infrastructure as networking became more widely available, it was problematic to try to run wires uh, through the ceilings because you had hanging lights, and a lot of times walls weren't really an option. So it's not necessarily the greatest transmission wiring in all situations, but certainly it's the most common. There's also shielded twisted pair, which has a heavier plastic sheath around the outside, and that offers more protection against different types of interferences, but it's also bulkier, so it's not as easy to work with. And then I just wanted to share a little bit of information about fiber optics because it's definitely a very viable alternative, and a lot of schools have fiber coming into them right now. I actually have AT&T Uverse at home, which is transmitted via fiber. So the nice thing about fiber optics is that the data isn't carried by electricity, it's carried by light. And as a result, the information can be transmitted a lot more efficiently than with wire, any kind of wire. So in addition, you don't have all of the potential interferences with the signals. So in terms of where you place the cabling relative to electrical currents or anything like that, or even weather conditions, fiber transmitted information is really not susceptible to those kinds of interferences. And that is it for today. I just wanted to share a little bit, like I said, to give you background. I didn't want to go into too much technical information, as we'll read up on more of that over the next couple of weeks, but hopefully this gives you kind of a foundational understanding of information related to networking. Have a great rest of the day.